This week on Newsnight, Central Florida food banks grapple with supply shortages triggered by federal funding cuts amid reports of unprecedented demand. Plus, Florida lawmakers discuss a potential sales tax cut as the state's finances come into focus. Newsnight starts now.
Hello, I'm Steve Mort. Welcome to Newsnight, where we take an in-depth look at the top stories and issues in Central Florida and how they shape our community. First tonight, food assistance in Central Florida. Food banks here say $1 billion of cuts to federal programs, including the USDA's Emergency Food Assistance Program, or TFAP, has left them without enough supplies to meet demand. The federal government supplements the diets of people with low incomes by providing them with emergency food assistance at no cost and buys food from farmers to send to food banks. The USDA has paused around half of TFAP's funding, $500 million, sourced from the Commodity Credit Corporation. The CCC provides a broad discretionary funding pool which paid, for example, for food assistance during the COVID pandemic. But some of the nation's largest food bank networks and distributors say demand is higher than it's ever been as U.S. hunger rates climb with the cost of living. It's impacting agencies like the Second Harvest Food Bank of Central Florida, which supplies pantries and other organizations throughout the region. Newsnight's Crystal Knowles spoke with the organization's president and CEO this week.
This is real impact. Changes in food pricing, changes in housing. We need more food, but we're going to get less. During the pandemic, we were around 300,000 meals a day. That was the request. It dropped to under 220,000 meals a day, but over the last year or so, it's back up to 300,000 meals a day.
Second Harvest Food Bank of Central Florida president and CEO,
that's the source of healthy food.
Derek Chubb says there will be a ripple effect from the Trump administration's decision to cut more than $1 billion in funding.
Was there any indication that this was going to happen?
No, not really. We had been watching the Farm Bill, which is where TFAP comes from, and wondering what might happen from that, but we didn't expect it to happen like that. Also, a week or so prior to that, there was another program that was put on pause as well.
The funding they lost for the rest of this fiscal year ending in September would have paid for 28 truckloads of food, this entire freezer, or these 4 rows of food.
Aisles, 1, 2, 3, 4, being completely empty.
This nonprofit is the largest charitable food supplier in the entire Central Florida. They serve about 80 million meals per year. This funding cut means they're losing about 910,000 meals.
Now that they foresee these cuts being permanent, the impact to Second Harvest Food Bank of Central Florida is going to affect millions of people in need. Many of them are on a fixed income, like veterans, seniors, and single-income households.
Now that we know that it's permanent, the impact is going to be around $11 million long-term for us, or about 7 or 8 million meals that will not make it to the tables of our friends and neighbors over the next year.
Chubb says farmers will also feel the impact.
We have great relationships with farmers, and we distributed around 40 million pounds last year of fresh produce. 75% of that was procured from Florida growers. So, yeah, and a decent amount of that we actually purchased. So this not only impacts us, this impacts their revenue as well. The need is going to continue to grow.
Are you worried?
Absolutely, very much, yeah.
Well, let's bring in our panel now to break it all down. And joining us in the studio this week, Jeff Allen from Spectrum News 13, covers politics over there. Thanks so much for coming in, Jeff. Really appreciate it.
Good to be here.
Good to see you. Beth Cassop, editor of the Winter Park Voice. Good to see you, Beth.
Yeah, great to be
Thanks
here.
for coming in. Ryan Lynch from the Orlando Business Journal. Good to see you as well today, Ryan. Thanks, guys, for coming in. Really appreciate it. Jeff, let me start with you on this one. And you covered the cuts to food banks this week. What have you been learning about those cuts?
Well, this just kind of came to them very quick. USDA, basically part of the overall federal government's efforts, of course, we've been seeing to cut what they say is waste, fraud, and abuse. Well, USDA said on a dime, we're dropping this funding from you. That obviously affects Second Harvest Food Bank, but they also distribute all that food to their smaller distributors, the food kitchens, the food banks in the local churches and other places. So that's really hurting them. Yeah, and those are the folks that really get that food to your local communities, ground level. So that's really hurting them right now. In fact, one church that does a twice monthly food bank says they're worried week to week they're going to be able to do that. And if they do it, they're not going to be able to give as much food to those folks, hundreds of people who depend on this.
I mean, do they report to you what we just heard in Crystal's piece, which is that there is growing demand?
Yeah, this is coming at really the worst time because they say while they're getting less now and they don't know when that it's a funding freeze, so they don't know if they're going to get it back or not, when that's going to happen. It's coming at a time where people have less and less food, they're having more trouble, and there's more demand.
They certainly seem at the Second Harvest Food Bank to think this could possibly be a permanent situation for them. You've reported in the past, Beth, on reliance some people have on food assistance, I guess particularly for nutritious foods. Do these cuts affect, do you think, low-income and rural areas disproportionately? That seems to be what we're hearing.
Well, right. I mean, what Jeff's talking about is Second Harvest then using its network to deliver some of this food to those areas specifically.
Yeah.
So you're going to see a huge difference in what the pantries can provide when people come in. And yeah, I mean, this is a time when inflation is still extremely stubborn. Food costs are high. This is affecting more people than a lot of us would think.
Yeah, I mean, some of this federal spending was aimed at relieving COVID hardships, right? During the pandemic, the Trump administration says those funds were designed to be temporary. Advocates say that the need for food, as we just heard, is higher than it's ever been. The CEO of Second Harvest Food Bank of Central Florida wrote an editorial for the OBJ last year. Why did they say that hunger remains such a pervasive issue in an economy which, by some measures, is not doing badly?
Yeah, even in a decent economy, I mean, you look at our issues with housing affordability and other things, people are really struggling to make those day-to-day costs, whether it's rising costs, we have a relatively low wage level of employment when it comes to our tourism industry. It's really tough for a lot of people to make ends meet. I know Heart of Florida United Way has a stat that nearly 400,000 Floridians in Seminole, Orange, and Osceola are struggling to make ends meet, and that's a huge deal. That's a lot of folks who are not just the people you think of, like, people experiencing homelessness. That's people who go to a job every day, who might work 2 jobs every day. So, we have some real challenges when it comes to those expenses.
At the same time, though, Jeff, Florida Senate leaders are looking to provide funding to supply food banks in Florida. I mean, what's in the Senate version of the budget? And what are Florida Republicans saying about food need in the state?
Of course, these state lawmakers, they're more directly connected, with their communities here. And this isn't, necessarily coming as a result of what's happened at the federal level, but it could be coming just in time because they're basically proposing about $50 million as part of that state budget that they're working through right now in Tallahassee to basically provide, it would work with Florida farmers, fresh from Florida, basically kind of give them a boost because it would give them some money and basically point that food towards food banks across the state. So this could be something that could really help them at a critical time when this federal funding is really in limbo.
Certainly interesting timing for sure, and for some people pretty fortuitous. Well, you can find a link to the Second Harvest Food Bank of Central Florida's food location tool on our website. If you need assistance yourself, it's at wcf.org/newsnight. Okay, next tonight, special elections this week for 2 of Florida's congressional seats. The Republicans won both, including Randy Fine in Central Florida's District 6, where he'll replace Mike Waltz, now President Trump's national security advisor. But the margin of victory for the GOP was down from November in those districts. Fine won by about 14 points, whereas Trump swept the district by 30 plus. I spoke this week with Aubrey Jewett, political scientist at the University of Central Florida.
I definitely think it had something to do a lot to do with Trump. And then historically, Democratic turnout in special elections was lower because they had, for instance, lower income blue collar workers as part of their base. Well, now a lot of those folks have switched over to the Republican side. And so Republicans say they have to start getting used to the idea that because now their base now includes maybe people who are not always going to turn out, whereas historically maybe they did include people that would do that they're going to have to figure out a better way, do a better job of mobilizing their base, who maybe used to be on the Democratic base and didn't show up, right? So that I think is an additional factor as well.
Aubrey Jewett from UCF. Jeff, you've been covering these races this week. What do you think about Aubrey Jewett's point there, that this is partly a repudiation of the Trump presidency, but also partly of the GOP's dependency on those lower propensity voters?
Yeah, of course you have Democrats that were trying to harness the displeasure, disapproval of what they say have been a negative agenda so far by President Donald Trump. So they were trying to get Democrats to the polls because of that. But you also saw a bigger turnout for a special election. Special elections usually are down at maybe like 15-20%. We saw actually over 30% turnout in some areas. That's really a big deal for something where you didn't have a president on the ticket, a state senator on the ticket. So what we saw here is Democrats, I think, coming out a little more. They're energized. They saw the defeats in last November elections across the country, here locally and in Florida. So they were more energized to come out, whereas Republicans, I think there was a sense of, hey, we got this in the bag. We've got all control here at the federal level, the Senate, the House here in Florida. So maybe not as much motivation for them to come out in a special election.
I mean, it was interesting, wasn't it, Beth, to look at the sort of the breakdown of how voters went in different parts of District 6. It certainly wasn't a straightforward win for the GOP.
Right. So, I think we're seeing the last couple days Democrats across the country trying to find some glimmers of hope from the special election results here and elsewhere, like Wisconsin. And
the Supreme Court race there.
Right. And, I think Volusia County jumped out at me. I guess just as a longtime Central Florida person, I'm used to Volusia going red. And the margin for Randy Fine and Volusia, I believe, was certainly slimmer than what the GOP is used to. And that's just kind of interesting if you're kind of sitting on the sidelines watching some of this play out.
Governor DeSantis said on Wednesday that this was not a repudiation of MAGA, but of Randy Fine himself, right, who he accused of repelling people. Some pretty strong remarks from the governor, and that it was only because of Trump's endorsement that Fine did as well as he did. Fine has certainly been a controversial figure, right, for some of his positions. Did that come across in the campaign at all?
Well, of course, he has faced ethics complaints in the past. Just last fall in October, he was in contempt of court for showing up and kind of, the judge said he mouthed potentially some obscenities and it was actually a virtual court appearance, but he was in a T-shirt and, so he was in contempt of court. But, that really didn't matter for Republican voters. That hasn't mattered really for them overwhelmingly as he's continued to, get into new public offices. So I think what you saw here is really, a situation where he got in, but it was a much smaller margin than what has been won in that district in the past, what Trump garnered in votes there. We were talking over 30% wins just last November.
We saw this in District 1 as well, right?
Yeah, District 1 and District 6. Yeah, and it was the same margin, about 14-15% wins in this. So that's about half of what we've seen. Much smaller margin, and it happened in both districts. So, I think that may be more of a kind of a thing between the governor and Fine there.
I mean, the other thing is that Fine did spend a lot of time during the campaign in Tallahassee, right? He was still a state senator, didn't resign until shortly before the election. He was also outraised in terms of money, right? There was a money advantage for the Democrats here.
Yeah, it was about 10-1 in this race between Randy Fine and the Democratic challenger, Josh Weil. So, of course, money can't do everything, and we saw, he did win, but again, a smaller margin there. Josh Weil was able to get out early with that money on ads on TV, print, media, with a lot of attacks against Randy Fine, and it could have, made some ground up.
And it'll certainly be interesting to see what this portends for the 2026 midterm elections. You can find more from my interview with Aubrey Jewett from UCF on our website. Visit us online at wucf.org/newsnight. Okay, next tonight, Florida's finances are a major topic of conversation this legislative session. Lawmakers are arguing over potential tax cuts and even where the tax burden in the state should lie. The Republican leader of the Florida House has proposed a $5 billion cut in the state's sales tax, while the governor says the priority should be cutting and eventually eliminating property taxes. Lawmakers are debating a number of joint resolutions to get the property tax idea on the ballot in 2026. The governor touted the proposals at the Florida Realtors Association in Orlando this week.
Property taxes are an anomaly because, they're not voluntary. Consumption taxes are basically voluntary. I go to the supermarket, most of the stuff you buy there's not taxed, right? But if I buy some other stuff that is not considered a staple, I just know I'm going to pay tax on it. If I go buy a big screen TV, I'm going to pay tax on it, and I can choose to buy that or not buy that. But you just basically, for subsisting and living on your own property, on your own parcel of land, your own home, particularly people that own it free and clear of any encumbrances, you got to just keep writing a check to the government just for the privilege of using your own property. And that's an anomaly. That's not the way good tax policy should be. It certainly undercuts the idea of private property that you own outside the reach of the government.
Governor DeSantis there, a reminder, we are recording the show on Thursday morning, so things can change by airtime. Ryan, let me start with you on this one. The governor wants voters to eliminate property taxes, right, the November election next year, but he's asking the legislature to do some other things more immediately. What does he want in the interim?
In the interim, he wants to have a $1,000 tax break for homestead folks in the state of Florida. He's kind of made this case that he wants that to apply to residents of Florida, whereas he's made the case that a sales tax break that potentially would help Floridians, but that would also help folks that are visiting. So he's kind of tried to position this as a way to ensure that Florida residents are getting this break, and we'll have to see whether that comes to pass.
Particularly for people with a homestead, so not second homes or vacation homes and things like that. We heard the governor just now make his case for eliminating property taxes. Beth, what's the pushback on that proposal? I imagine there is quite a lot of pushback.
There is, especially on the local government level. And I would say, as somebody who's lived here and reported on these issues for 25 plus years, the governor's description of property taxes is really a vast mischaracterization and misrepresentation. You are not being taxed for simply the privilege of living on your own land that you own. You're being taxed because the infrastructure around you costs money to maintain. So if you prefer that your roads are nice and clean and paved, and that there's sidewalks and parks and schools, that's what that money is going toward. It has very little to do with the fact that you're just simply sitting there remaining on the property.
And local governments say they do rely on that property tax revenue, right? And in some cases, particularly in Winter Park, there is talk about trying to increase property taxes. You've covered that discussion in that city.
Yeah, so since the pandemic, we have seen local governments across Central Florida, many of them up their millage rate by a little bit. And the millage rate is what is used to determine how much you pay on property taxes in your town or in your county, depending on which jurisdiction you live in. Winter Park has not done this. They've maintained the same millage rate for 16 years. They have been able to collect more taxes because each year the housing market's been pretty good and the values go up, right? Yeah. So they've been able to continue on providing the same services and even increasing services in some cases by just adapting to those value increases. But there is some discussion, should they target a small increase to help with transportation, understand or with police and fire? That's been also part of the discussion. And people need to understand that wiping out property taxes, that's how local governments fund police and fire. So if you appreciate the fact that you can call 911 and get some help, that's what that money's paying for.
And the governor would push back against that, and we'll hear from the governor again in a moment. The governor says he thinks, Ryan, that tourists should make up the revenue gap. But at the moment, tourist development tax dollars, the bed tax or hotel tax as we call it, can only be used in very specific ways. What are the current constraints?
So right now, they can only use for tourist development type purposes. That includes tourist infrastructure. You think of in Orange County, the convention center or some of the sports stadiums as well.
Right.
You have as well Visit Orlando for tourism promotion purposes, kind of having ads and other things out in the community. You know, they promote kind of all over the world when it comes to the destination, but others have tried to have that expanded to other uses like, transportation.
Sure.
Tourists use that here. Why can't we use it for that? But you can't do that.
Getting tourists to pay more for things, right, Jeff, seems to sort of line up with long-time Democratic demands for more diversified use of hotel taxes. We seem to see this play out every year when counties decide how to divvy up that money. And there is actually a legislative effort this session, to free up that TDT money.
Yeah, basically it's led by some Democratic senators in the state house, and they basically want to reduce the amount that goes towards those direct, these advertising efforts. They actually criticized one. It was like a $600,000 ad that was directed towards Taylor Swift fans, basically to get them to come to, theme parks in Central Florida. And they say, we want more of that money kind of going towards concerns here in Central Florida. So they want to reduce the amount that would go towards that and increase the amount that would go towards things like maybe affordable housing or needs that they say that people who work at those theme parks need because they don't make enough money. So that's kind of what they're looking for here.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see how the tourist industry comes down on that. At the same time as the property tax discussion, Florida's House leadership recently laid out its proposals for cutting sales tax. The Florida Policy Institute says sales and excise taxes make up about 80% of Florida's revenue. Democrats and some economists say there would need to be an increase in sales taxes to accommodate a property tax cut. But Republican House Speaker Daniel Perez wants sales tax cut from 6 to 5.25%. The governor, meanwhile, appears lukewarm on the idea. He says a sales tax cut would amount to a tax break for tourists and that property taxes should be the priority. Here is Speaker Perez, followed by the governor.
The membership's excited about it. The membership is very excited. We have continued to state how much of a responsibility we feel as the legislature, as the House, as members of the House, to cut the fat of the budget. And we said that opening day, we said organization session, and today is just the beginning of what the membership has been wanting for so long.
And at the end of the day, it's about Florida first. We've got to put Floridians first. I don't want to keep taxing Floridians on these properties to be able to subsidize a tax cut for Canadians. I'd rather the Canadians pay taxes to subsidize the reduction in Florida property taxes. It just makes sense to me.
Governor DeSantis there. Jeff, it seems from what we heard just now that there's disagreement, I would say it's fair to say, amongst Republicans over tax priorities. The governor seems lukewarm on those sales tax cuts, doesn't he? The legislature seems lukewarm on his property tax ideas. Spectrum News heard from the president of the Senate about this. What are you guys hearing?
Well, yeah, it's interesting. Democrats are kind of sitting by and kind of letting Republicans work this out because they kind of want to do things differently here. The Senate president has expressed concerns about lowering the sales tax because they're looking ahead towards, if we see more economic downturn, they still want to kind of have that rainy day fund. Right now, there would be about maybe $2 billion left in the budget. It may seem like a lot, but if we have an economic shortfall, they worry reducing sales tax is going to reduce extra reserve funding in the state. They want to be fiscally responsible. So the governor has not said that he would necessarily veto the sales tax idea, but he wants to prioritize the homestead, the property tax. He wants to get that in first, and then from there, they're going to work this out. And it'll be interesting over the next month how they can come to agreement here, because right now they are not in agreement.
I mean, a lot of this revenue discussion ties in with the Florida DOGE effort targeting spending at local governments and state higher education institutions. Governor DeSantis says he wants to look into the finances of local governments, which he says will show that if property taxes are cut, local services would not be in jeopardy, as critics claim. Here's the governor on that in Orlando this week, followed by the Democrats' leader in the Florida House, Fentrice Driscoll.
We have major counties in this state that have had massive expansions of their budgets just in the last 5 or 6 years. And the reason is they're getting more revenue from the property tax. And do those budgets need to grow by that much? I think the answer is probably going to be no, but we want to be able to do that so that voters can see, because they'll tell you, they can't do property tax relief because then you're not going to have any police or anything. That's not true.
The Florida Constitution actually requires the state to have a commission on government efficiency. It's actually in our state constitution, and it's mandated to meet every 4 years to make the sorts of recommendations, well, actually logical, reasonable recommendations that you would hope that a Florida DOJ would. So when I see that there's a Florida DOJ being created, it just looks to me like the governor trying to get into national headlines.
Fentrice Driscoll there to note, WCF is licensed to the University of Central Florida, one of the higher education institutions subject to Florida DOJ scrutiny. Beth, the governor is pressing ahead with his plans for a Florida version of DOJ. How is that effort taking shape?
So what we've seen so far on the local government level is the governor's DOJ folks have sent emails to city governments and county governments and asked them some very basic questions like, hey, have you defaulted on your loans? Have you defaulted on any other creditors? Have you been running major deficits? And most cities, like let's say Winter Park, for example, they are run pretty conservatively from a fiscal basis. Yeah. They have a huge reserve fund that they insist on maintaining for a rainy day because there have been weather events, hurricanes, and the pandemic where they've had to dip into that from time to time. So, I'm not sure how far the DOJ effort is going to go. I will mention, there's been some reporting that the governor did hire one of the inspector generals from the Department of Transportation who was actually fired by Trump.
By the Trump administration, that's right, yes.
And so it'll be interesting to see whether anything else comes of this effort, whether they try to dig in more on city and county governments. But so far, it's been kind of a couple emails.
Well, the finances of state and local government certainly in the spotlight. I'm sure you guys will keep an eye on this conversation. A reminder, you can find us on social media. We're at WCF TV on Facebook and Instagram. You'll also find us at Newsnight WCF on X. But that is all the time we have for this week. My thanks to Jeff Allen, Beth Kassob, and Ryan Lynch. Thank you guys so much for coming in. Really appreciate your time today. We'll see you next Friday night at 8:30 here on WCF. From all of us here at Newsnight, take care and have a great week.